In 1982, the picturesque town of Kingscliff on the north coast of New South Wales attracts national attention when it's the scene of a bizarre act of human depravity. A 13-year-old boy is abducted, tortured, and buried alive. He stabbed a total of 30 times, and every part of his body is defiled by his captors. It's also the setting of an astonishing story of survival, of how his friend, another 13-year-old boy, is able to convince the killers to let him go. If it wasn't for his extraordinary courage, there's no telling how many more victims there could have been.
Off me! Oh, shut up! Get up! You shut up! Get off me!
I remember waking up and my brother bashing on the door going, he's going off tap, something happened, and my mum and dad come out and they're going, what's wrong, and oh, my mate's been murdered, or something's happened, and I was like half asleep, you know.
It's a cool autumn night when 13-year-old Terry Ryan is driven to his home in the Brisbane suburb of Marsden. Terry is breathless and shaking, and what he tells his family can only be described as horrendous. Accompanied by his mother, Terry is taken to the local police station, where he repeats his ordeal to Queensland CIB detectives.
So, where did you first meet these men?
When me and Peter were hitchhiking along the main road.
The detectives listen intently as Terry describes in detail what he and another young teenager, Peter Aston, have endured that afternoon.
And the bloke under the bonnet, he told us to hop in.
Terry tells how they're abducted at knife point by two men, driven over the border to New South Wales, and in bushland near Kingscliff, just south of Tweed Heads, how the two men sexually molest and torture Peter Aston.
I was covered in blood. I had bruised black eyes. They thought that I was trying to come up with some story to let Peter get away. They thought that I was making up a concoction story.
Unsure of what to make of Terry's claims, the Queensland detectives take him and his mother to Tweed Heads police station. There, they meet up with the Detective Senior Constable Mark Ferguson.
They had this young kid, 13-year-old Terry Ryan, with them, and Terry was telling the story about how he'd been with his mate, Peter Aston, who'd been bashed really badly and tortured.
Get up! Shut up!
Well, we chatted to Terry for a while, then went south towards Kingscliff. On the way down, we stopped at a place called Faux Park, which is on the riverside, just at South Tweed Heads. And I think he pointed out a bin there where there was some, I think he told us that there was some clothing or something been thrown in the bin, and there was a toilet there that something had been disposed of there.
Terry then directs the detectives to bushland near Kingscliff, where he says he and Peter had been taken.
That's an area where fishermen used to go fishing on the beach, and there was a lot of tracks off the highway, off the road. So there were about 1,000 tracks off that main road towards the beach. Anyway, Terry Ryan took us to a track and said it's this one. So we went in and had a look, and there was nothing. And then he took us to another one, and there was nothing. And he took us to another one, and there was nothing. And were getting a bit impatient with him, and the story was so fantastic I wasn't quite sure whether to believe him or not. So I put him under a bit of pressure and tested him out a bit. He became very angry and fired up, and he came back at me really with great force, and I thought, well, this kid's telling the truth. So we decided we'd have a look at some more tracks, which we did, and ultimately came to a track where we saw signs of activity, and Terry started to become very agitated, and he was pointing out things that he saw that he recognised.
I was told by Ferguson, that Mark Ferguson, that he spotted some blood spatters in a tree in the area. That's what really made them look a little bit closer, which was pretty remarkable, and because they were only going by torchlight that hour.
There was a mound, and it was covered with some bush, and we're in sort of bushy area, low salt bush and stuff near the beach. And he pointed out this mound, and I'll never forget, as long as I live, walking over there and seeing this large, really wet patch of blood in the sand. And I can see that today, the red blood that had soaked up through the sand. And at that point, Terry became really distressed and sobbing, and he looked to be terribly afraid.
There was a knife in a sheath in the sand, which it looked as if it had been abandoned there or accidentally lost. There was a sock near the gravesite. And of course we wanted to ensure the integrity of the murder scene. We established that there indeed was a body in there, so it was left as it was at that stage.
So there was a couple of things that I needed to do, was to, one, preserve the crime scene, get scientific police involved, get them called out, get them to come and examine the scene. Not only that, the criminal investigation police in the Northern Rivers were then under the command of Detective Sergeant Eric Strong. I needed to get in touch with him and get the troops out, more or less, which I did.
Terry repeats the details of how the two boys are abducted to Detective Inspector Bob Jackson. And while Terry has led police to Peter Aston's body, they're just a little sceptical about his story. Why would two men torture and kill his friend and then leave Terry alive to tell the tale? How and why Terry survived is going to astonish everyone, and it'll help police close in on two sadistic killers. In the early hours of May 5th, 1982, 13-year-old Terry Ryan leads New South Wales and Queensland detectives to a shallow grave in bushland at Kingscliff, just south of Tweed Heads. Lying in the grave is the body of another 13-year-old, and police now need to know what involvement, if any, Terry had with Peter Aston's murder.
Yeah, you didn't know she's going to come to me, but...
Just say you don't know anything. Yeah, she wouldn't realise anyway. She probably won't realise I'm gone. She's out of it most of the time.
Wish me luck.
The day before, Terry and Peter meet at 8:30 in the morning and decide to skip school.
So, does your mum know?
Nah, and I'd love to keep it that way. She's been pissing me off something awful.
Peter is going to hitchhike to Melbourne to be with his elder brother, while Terry agrees to accompany his friend as far as the Gold Coast and then return home.
So once we hit the border, I'm going to leave you and then just head back home.
Yeah, that should be sweet, mate.
During their journey, the boys shoplift some clothes and cigarettes.
Righto, turn it over.
As they walk along the highway looking for a ride, they come across a man appearing to repair his yellow four-wheel drive.
Yeah, give it a bit of a rev.
A second man sits inside the car.
Hey, ask if we can get a lift.
Yeah, righto, turn it off.
Excuse me. you reckon we could get a lift down the coast?
Yeah, sure. You and your mate jump in. We're ready to go.
Thanks.
Jump in the front if you want, mate.
Thanks for that.
I thought that was something a bit strange when Rob and Reid said one of yous hop in the front, the other one hop in the back. And I did think that was a bit suspicious at the time, but I was too young to sort of like click on.
So where are you going to send?
Oh, we're just going up the highway a little way. We should be able to give you a bit some of the way.
Yeah. Oh, thanks.
So who's down in Melbourne?
My brother.
And as soon as I got in the back and we drove off, I had a double-barrel shotgun pointed at my head, and Peter was told if he moved that I would get shot. And then they pulled over and handcuffed him to the behind the seat.
The two men tell the boys that they're police before driving off again. During the drive, both men lash out at the boys.
I got a few hits in the head with the gun for asking questions. I was told to mind my own business, I shouldn't be speaking. They drove to a narrow strip of road at Kingscliff and drove down a track. They knew where it was because they told us that they'd been there before and committed similar offences before, but let other people go as well. Well, as soon as we pulled up at Kingscliff at the beach, the first thing they did was Reid got out of the car. As Paul got out, I was still in the car, and they pulled Peter out and put thumb cuffs on his toes. And after they did that, they were having gags, jokes, telling him that he couldn't get away. Then they got me out of the car, and I got a swift kick in the groin with steel cap boots on, and I was down on the ground for quite some time. I couldn't talk. Very, very, very sore.
Get off me! No! Shut up! Get up! You shut up! Get off! Get off! Come on, you bastard! Leave us alone! Get out of here!
And in the process of this was happening, Peter was getting repeatedly punched, kicked, belted around. And it was like it was a game. They were actually laughing, commenting on it, having little chats to themselves.
Get off!
Peter was screaming. They couldn't shut him up. No one could. There was no houses or nothing around anywhere, so he could scream like no one could hear. So they stripped his clothes off, like virtually just ripped his clothes off his back, and at least over half of the clothing was shoved down his throat. And they used his shirt to tie the gag. While they were doing this, they then took it in turns of stabbing him. Peter was in the middle, and there was Robin at the front. Paul was at the back, and they just took it in turns, stabbing him.
Just shut up! Get off!
Vulnerable, the men begin to torture Peter.
Stop!
They also know what they're doing, inflicting severe pain, but not enough to kill their prey. Terry can do little but watch his friend be beaten, abused, and burnt with cigarettes.
They bashed him with a shovel, they bashed him with a rifle to the extent that they broke the rifle butt over his head. They put handcuffs on him. They put toe cuffs on each of his big toes to hold his toes together as a form of incredible pain and torture, in my view, at that time. And then they stabbed him repeatedly, burnt him with a aerosol spray can with a match in front of it like a mini blowtorch. And the question was, how have we got this young man? Why isn't he there in the grave next to him?
See how he likes this?
So I had to try and think very smart and very quickly as fast as I possibly could. And if I couldn't save us both, at least get one of us saved so we could come out and get these guys caught for what they had done. So I ended up using a bit of street talk and said, look...
Can I join you?
Yeah, sure. Pick up that shovel.
And doing some acts that I didn't really want to commit.
Nah, not like that, mate. Hold it like this. Hit him.
I had to bury my friend alive, put him all the sand, dig the hole, put him in it, and cover him up.
Go on, hit him again. Hit him.
Drove back to through the Gold Coast, and in the process of driving through the Gold Coast, they pulled up at a park where they disposed of Peter's what clothing was they had of his, and they went to a toilet in the park and get cleaned up. wash the blood and stuff and all that off them. And I could hear them, they were joking about it, making it big fun. It was like it was a big game to them. Then they asked me where I lived. And I didn't know how to tell them somewhere else, so I didn't lie. So they drove me within about 2 minutes to the house where my parents are still living in.
The experience was obviously horrendous for him, and you could feel that he had an element of guilt because at one stage he'd hit Peter Ashton with a shovel, but with no intent to hurt him a great deal. But I think it was an act of survival because he thought that if he did something like that, that they'd spare him and that he wouldn't be murdered also.
And of course there was suspicion, you know what people are like. People were, there's more to this than he says, or, he had a lot more to do it. And here he is suffering incredibly about the death of his friend and the circumstances surrounding the death of his friend. Terrible, terrible thing.
Some of his friends knocked him that, my parents got spat on a bit, but they didn't know the whole story. They weren't there. They didn't have to deal with his mate being murdered.
I recall being present when Peter Ashton was taken out of the grave where he was buried, and I could see what had been done to him and the horrific injuries that he'd sustained and the torture that he'd been through. And I recall at the time that I just could not comprehend how somebody could do this to another person, particularly a child.
He wasn't going to, if he had survived, he would have just been a complete vegetable. He had half, or a portion of his scalp missing, where they'd scalped him. He was stabbed through the top of the head. He had his throat slit. His ears were pierced with a leather punch, 2 or 3 holes each ear. He was hit that hard with a shotgun, double barrel that gun, that the gun was in 2 pieces after the blow.
Oh, it's hideous. Like, to children, they're worse than, we talk of pedophiles, and in the jails they call them rock spiders, but this was worse, if that's possible, and it was. And whatever we do and however efficient we are and do what we do as police means nothing. You can't bring a life back of a little boy.
It's very hard to imagine the impact that it must have had on the detectives immediately involved with this case, let alone the family. We can't even comprehend what the family must have gone through. What a terrible, terrible way to die.
Ashton's friend witnessed his companion's shocking death.
As police gather what they can from the crime scene, detectives continue to question Terry to get as much information as possible about the 2 abductors.
He told us that these people had haircuts like coppers, as he said, short front, back and sides. And he thought they might have been police, but they were talking about army a lot. And one was Bob and one was Paul. And they drove a little Jeep. And he told me the name of the Jeep. He said, I can't say it. I can't say the name of it, but I can write it down for you. So he wrote down Daihatsu, but he just couldn't get his tongue around that. So we were looking at a little 4x4 Daihatsu Jeep type vehicle. And they were quite common, and particularly in beach front areas those days, because they were used as fishermen's vehicles.
Police consider their next move carefully. They agree to circulate the descriptions of the 2 men, Bob and Paul, as well as a description of the yellow Daihatsu 4x4. They have no idea if the 2 men are locals or opportunists passing through, but either way, it won't be long before the circulation yields a major lead. In May of 1982, Queensland and New South Wales police worked together, hunting for two sadistic killers who abducted, molested and tortured 13-year-old Peter Aston. Peter's shallow grave was uncovered in bushland near the beach at Kingscliff in northern New South Wales. Police were alerted to the murder by another teenager, Terry Ryan, who was also abducted, but using his street smarts, managed to con his captors and escape with his life.
Well, young Ryan showed us where they stopped on the way, disposed of certain garments, like the kids' clothing was thrown in a dumpster bin at South Tweed Heads. They went to a toilet block and washed up the blood off them there, which we later found to be in the S-bend of the toilet block. They went into Coolangatta and bought themselves something to eat because they were hungry. And they found Ashton's glasses in the car, so they threw them in a garbage bin in Griffith Street, Coolangatta. They threw his hat off a bridge on the Gold Coast Highway. They went up to Mount Cootha area and they threw away the shovel and they pulled the rifle to pieces and threw it out of the car into the scrub off them.
As police wait to see what information comes in from the public, they continue studying the crime scene and searching for evidence.
First of all, we were asked to retrieve one sock and one T-shirt from a garbage bin in a park at Tweed Heads. We got to the particular garbage bin that we were going to allegedly find these items, and it had been cleaned out by the council truck only a couple of hours before. We then went to the Stotts Island council tip, and we spent something like 6 or 7 hours going through 25,000 tonnes of rubbish. Unfortunately, it got worse because it had actually been dozed into the tip. And of course, the good news was, as I say, it could have been crucial evidence. We recovered the one sock and the one T-shirt, and we went back to the police station with the items. No one would come anywhere near us for about 3 days.
With the Queensland Police, they emptied their academy out the next day and took all the recruits out, and they did a drive right through that forest, and they found a shovel, they found a broken shovel handle, they found all the bits and pieces of the gun. So we gathered an enormous amount of evidence.
The autopsy report is quickly given to the investigating detectives, revealing the true horror that Peter Aston suffered at the hands of his killers.
See how he likes this?
So they tortured him and belted him more and kicked him. And just to make sure, they poured sand down into his mouth. Dr. Follett, the GMO, was of the view, and a very, very experienced pathologist, was of the view that that's probably what killed the young man. He was buried alive.
Since that time, we've seen things just as bad, but it's still unimaginable. It's just difficult. Well, you can't comprehend how somebody, a sane person, could do those sorts of things to another person, particularly kids.
The next day, the boss of the homicide in Brisbane had come and returned to the police station, and he knocked on the door and he called me out and he said, we've just had a phone call from an anonymous person who suggested that the Robin and Paul that you're looking for are soldiers at the Enoggera Army camp. They drive a vehicle the same, and their descriptions are the same.
And inquiries led to Enoggera Army Base in southeast Queensland. Police were dispatched to the Army Base, and it was a pretty hot lead, and I think that we all felt that we were onto them.
I then went up to Enoggera and found with Ian Spears and the Queensland Police, and we went to a particular room in the dormitory there, and I found that the place was very interesting, to say the least.
We found over 30 knives, there were scalpels, there were swords, there were books of young males in very unusual sex positions and in bondage positions. We found library books. Well, when I say library books, we found books that were either came from a library or privately purchased, which had on the subjects of Satanism, bondage, masochism. One book that I do recall was called the Devil's Bible, and all of these bizarre things. And of course, the thing that really concerned us was that we found a scrapbook with dozens of samples of collections of pubic hairs, and next to each sample in the scrapbooks, the little plastic folds, was a Christian name and the word pubic or groin or underarm, so we knew that they were what hairs they were.
The room in the barracks belongs to 34-year-old Robin Reid, also known as Bob, and 17 years old Paul Luckman.
Reid was a corporal, and Luckman was a reasonably recent recruit. They roomed together in this particular part of the barracks, but they had gone before we got down there. And as we arrived, the commander at Enoggera told us that there was another soldier missing in his car. So we circulated that car, and of course then we didn't know whether we had 3 people involved in the murder or not. But in the Daihatsu that was still there, we found so many things. It was just identical to the very precise way in which young Ryan had told about us the day before.
Yes, we found crutches in the room, and it's not unusual to find crutches anywhere, but we later discovered that these crutches were actually acquired by Luckman after the murder, and it was revealed that he injured his foot whilst kicking the victim, Peter Aston, and he injured the foot to the point where he had to seek medical assistance from the RAP, the Regimental Aid Post.
Luckman and Reid are now on the run. They're driving a Holden Sunbird that's registered to another soldier, Private Robert Ponzetti. There's no knowing where they've gone or if they'll kill again. With Queensland and New South Wales police on high alert for the killers, the detectives can now only wait. Just one day after finding the shallow grave of 13-year-old Peter Aston, police are on the hunt for his killers, 17-year-old Paul Luckman and 34-year-old Robin Reid. Luckman and Reid are soldiers billeted at the Enoggera Army camp on the outskirts of Brisbane. When police arrive, they find that their 2 suspects are gone, along with another soldier, Private Robert Ponzetti, whose Holden Sunbird they're now travelling in. Their barracks are searched and investigators find knives and gay pornographic material, along with a collection of pubic hairs belonging to a variety of men.
And the news from there was that they'd discovered the rooms where these people had been living, and there was signs of witchcraft and things like that, so we knew that we were there.
So we gathered up all this evidence. We had the Queensland scientific people there with us to photograph it as we took it in situ. So we took possession of that, and while I was doing this, I received a phone call to go to the commander's office, and I'd been told that as a result of it circulating the car of the other young soldier that had disappeared, that there was a young man, a soldier, had presented himself to the Tenterfield police station and told the police there that he'd been abducted by 2 soldiers named Rob and Bob, who had told him that they had killed the boy at Kingscliff a couple of days ago. The day after the murder, he was in the mess at the camp, and he was approached by Reid and Luckman and told that Luckman had hurt himself and would he use his car to drive them to the hospital off base. And he agreed to, and they got into this young man's car, leaving the Daihatsu back at the camp at the base. And when they got him in the car and off base, they abducted him with a knife across his throat and told them to drive them. And they directed him to go down the New England Highway.
Where a description of them was circulated and their motor vehicle. And the next news we got was that they'd been stopped and captured on the New England Highway and taken to Glen Innes Police Station.
So when we learned of their arrest at Glen Innes, then it was my function to inform headquarters, and I drove up to Glen Innes, where we saw the two suspects as they were at that stage.
When the boys got into the car, what was said?
The boys told us that they'd stolen some cigarettes, I think 20 packets, and that the clothes that they were wearing were stolen.
Robin Reid was, if I recall, in his early 30s, probably about 6'1", 6'2".
I remember that I hit him. I don't remember how many times or how severe, but I only used my hand. I'm not normally a violent person. Nothing was said about the little one, but I think I hit him once.
Weight about 90 to 100 kilos, very fit, solid, big man. Comparing him to the size of Peter Aston, Aston wouldn't have had a chance of handling a man of his size and fitness. He was very cocky. He treated me with respect. He related to me as sir all the time during the interview. Obviously coming from his military background, that he had to respect people of a higher rank, of an officer material or whatever.
We said yes. He helped us.
Yeah, he was quite easy to interview.
He burned the big one with a cigarette, punched a hole in his ear, and he kicked him.
I sat there and listened to Reid explain, or try to explain what had happened, and he was trying to persuade us that he'd been hearing voices and that he was perhaps setting up some sort of basis for a defence of insanity.
So what did you do with the big one then?
Paul hit him with a shovel to quiet him and stabbed him. Then all three of us helped bury him, because that's what we were told to do. And that's all I remember at this stage.
At the end of the interview, he pointed to a pen on the table and boasted that he could kill me within a few seconds, and I asked him how he was going to do that. He said he was capable of picking up the pen and jamming it into my ear, into my brain, and I would be dead, which was I thought was quite amusing at the time, because I'd also spent some time in the army and I knew that what he was saying was rubbish. Yeah, he was just fooling himself, and that's the sort of fellow he was.
Okay, Paul, can you tell me what happened first?
Well, Luckman, of course, protested his innocence to start with, and of course blamed the older man, Reid. But there's no doubt that from the evidence that Luckman inflicted more brutal, at times, more brutal injuries on the victim than Reid himself. And certainly there's evidence that when they put the young fellow in the grave, and it's believed by the after the post-mortem that he was probably buried alive, he actually heard a gurgling noise come from the victim, and he shoved sand and dirt down the boy's throat to virtually to finish him off. And then they covered the body up.
And Bob then covered him up.
Well, Reid was born in the UK to good, solid family, working family stock. They lived in Brisbane. I didn't meet his parents and his brother, and he went off and joined the army, and there was, not to my knowledge, nothing to ever bring him to the attention of any law enforcement agencies. He had a number of jobs, panel beating and things like that before he joined the army. And to all intents and purposes, just an ordinary guy.
But the thing I can tell you about Reid is that the army considered that he had a very, very high IQ, and exceptionally high IQ actually. So he was in many ways wasted in terms of what he could have achieved in his life, I think. Luckman came from a broken home in Victoria. His mother was an alcoholic, and we also established, and this was from his own mouth, he was a cross-dresser. He, at one point in time, he lived off the proceeds of prostitution, male prostitution. And of course then he later joined the army. When he was sent to Nogra Army Barracks, Reid was actually in charge of allocating the accommodation. And which was normal practice for Reid, when new soldiers came, because he was a corporal, when new soldiers came to the barracks, he would have them move in with him initially, because he wanted to assess whether or not they would be suitable for perhaps introducing or taking part in his occult, Satanism, witchcraft, bonding type activities. And of course that's exactly what happened with Luckman.
The two soldiers were under heavy police guard this morning when they were marched from the Glenniness police station about 70 metres to the town's century-old stone courthouse.
So they were subsequently charged with the murder of Peter Ashton and the abduction of the other soldiers. And they were locked up in the lock-up at Glenniness for the night. The next morning I applied for them to be released into our custody. Reid was to return with me and Spears to Tweed Heads and to the murder scene.
Police transport Luckman and Reid back to the crime scene at Kingscliff, where both men show police what happened the day of the killing.
Reid was quite chatty, and it didn't take long to assess that he was enjoying these 15 minutes of fame.
Well, we've spent something like altogether 3 to 5 days doing a runaround, which is these two offenders were cooperating with us because it suited their needs to cooperate with us. I looked after Reid with Bob Jackson, and we did the runaround. They took us and we retraced every step before, during and after the murder. And we recovered the rifle that had been dumped. We recovered the shovel, knives, and a whole variety of things, and they were exactly where Reid had said they were.
We had a forensic scientific man with us who photographed just about everything that we did, including a photograph of Reid sitting on a pile of sand that was used to extricate the young man's body from the grave, with his feet in the grave, with his hand cuffed in front of him, and he was smiling. And that was as a result of just his demeanour. He didn't show any remorse. He did say to me, I'm a bit frightened that that photograph that man just took will show me to be a callous person, and I don't feel any remorse about this. And I said, which photograph are you talking about? He said, the one with me smiling, sitting at the grave.
A date for the committal hearing is set, and the investigators are satisfied that they have a solid case, despite Luckman and Reid trying to blame the other as the instigator. But police haven't heard it all. The media coverage surrounding Peter Aston's murder brings out information of an earlier abduction and a very lucky escape.
The court was told that both men had been apprehended at a roadblock near Glenniness yesterday afternoon. Police said they had established the roadblock after another soldier from the Enoggera Army Camp in Brisbane had told police he had been abducted by two men who had released him near Tenterfield, nearly 100 kilometres north of Glen Innes.
In 1982, two soldiers, Paul Luckman and Robin Reid, are arrested and charged with the abduction, torture and murder of 13-year-old Peter Aston. They're also charged with the abduction of fellow soldier, Private Robert Ponzetti. Luckman and Reid have yet to appear at the committal hearing when police receive information of an attempted abduction just days before Aston's murder.
We received a phone call, one of our crew did, from a young man named Bruce, who was subsequently interviewed. And he told the story that he was at a nightclub on the Gold Coast a couple of nights beforehand. And he met these two guys that fitted the description of Reid and Luckman. And they took him to an area that he couldn't identify, but it was similar, somewhere down near the Coolangatta airport. They let him go and they told him if he could get away, he'd live. And Reid stalked him through the scrub with a bow and arrow. This young man, obviously, through fear, had induced an asthma attack. When I later spoke to Reid about it, he said he has been an asthmatic. And he felt sorry for the kid and took him home. And the young fellow was smart enough to screw an arrowhead off an arrow shaft and keep it. So they dropped him off and he went back to his flat where he was staying with a couple of his mates where they lived. And he told them, and they told him not to bother going to the police because it's such a preposterous story that the police probably wouldn't even listen to him.
Of course, they were satisfied that he couldn't identify them. So that was another reason they let him go. Very lucky boy. He was only a teenager as well.
The police case is overwhelming and Luckman and Reid are committed to stand trial by the local magistrate. Because of the gravity of the charges against the pair, the matter's to be heard before Justice Roden in the Supreme Court in Sydney. On the 8th of November 1982, Luckman and Reid face a packed courtroom and a jury of 3 women and 9 men. Part of the prosecution evidence involves the crime scene photographs, particularly those that show the appalling injuries to Peter Aston's body.
The photographs, which were numerous, were horrific, and they showed in detail what had happened to him. And I recall having a debate with the Crown Prosecutor, David Shillington. David Shillington's opinion that they were just too horrific, too stark and too horrifying for members of the jury, and particularly females, to see. Ultimately, a folder containing all the photographs of the body was shown to, handed up to Judge Roden, and his body reaction showed that he was horrified also by sitting back on the bench. I also recall when my record of interview was being read out to the jury by the judge's associate that female members of the jury were actually crying their eyes out. Yeah. So it had a big impact on a lot of people, just the sheer cruelty and of what the boy went through.
Look, they showed no emotion, either of them, at the committal proceedings or at the trial. They just had the cold, glassy look right through the proceedings.
After quite a lengthy trial, they were both found guilty of murder and I think and sentenced to long terms of imprisonment, life imprisonment, and Roden at the time commented that it was probably the worst crime of that nature that had been committed in this state for many, many years.
Today in the Supreme Court, Mr. Justice Roden described the crime as one of the most brutal and sadistic ever seen in the state.
All in all, it was an excellent job, but you can never get away from the regret that there's no way in the world any of us can bring back that boy from, like, he's missed out on all these Christmases and the development and the years that he'd should have still been alive and would have been a useful citizen, and these fellas have just taken his life away from him in those circumstances. Dreadful.
I'd confronted victims of road trauma, of accidental death, of suicide. I'd seen dead bodies in the relatively short time that I'd been in the police. But I'd never confronted anything like this where somebody had deliberately tortured another person, let alone a young boy.
Paul Luckman, he underwent a sex change operation, a full sex change operation in 1990, and he effectively assumed the identity of a woman from that time. That sex change operation was whilst he was in prison and at your expense and my expense. And then in 1993, he changed his name by deed poll to Nicole Louise Pearce. And he was subsequently, being a changed man, he was released from prison, or she was released from prison in 1999.
It is murder, isn't it?
I understand that Reid's still in jail, and that's where he should stay, but that's up to the authorities to decide when he's going to be released. But I would imagine Reid would be close to 60. I wouldn't be surprised if Reid was ever released that he would probably reoffend.
You know, he's the worst one, Reid. Well, they shouldn't let him out. He's a psychopath killer. He's killed a kid. If they let him out, what, he's not going to kill another kid? He's not going to kill one of my kids or one of your kids or any kids, you know? He's a psycho. He's ruined my brother's head for life. What he said, had to do, he's ruined his life. And my parents' life.
If the parole board actually understood how vicious and how bald these guys were,
Get off me!
if they had, it wasn't a video. It was real life. It was actually happening. And what these guys did.
See how he likes this?
They don't have the right to be alive. The death penalty should be in Australia for these sorts of vicious crimes.
Please don't, please. Terry, help! Terry, help!
If they were in America, they'd have been dead now.
I believe that this crime, and I believe that Robin Reid was the main instigator of this crime, is so bad that the fact that he was sentenced to 24 years in jail is not enough. He's been there for his 24 years. He's been there another 3 years. Every year he comes up for parole review, and it's been rejected every time. Having written about every case of never to be released in Australia, I believe that this case is as bad as any of them, and I believe that Robin Reid should be kept in jail for the rest of his life and should never be released.
Get off me! I told you to shut up! Peter! Riley!